Welcome to the BASIS Wednesday webinar series. This is the first for 2021. I'm Chris Whitaker, Chair of the Management Committee for BASIS, and today we have with us Phil Horton from the RYA. Phil sits on our committee as a member and has been involved with sustainability for well over 20 years, so highly experienced in this field. Phil's going to talk to us about the strategy that he put together for the RYA, how he went about it, and the processes that he had to follow in order to achieve what does look like a really well thought through strategy. Okay, so we'll make a start and I'll hand over to Phil. Thank you.
With staff and interested parties as we put the strategy together. So the key thing for me really is, from my perspective, is that kind of engagement of people in the development of the strategy and the embedding of it within the organisation. So in terms of where this all came from, the RYA has been interested in environmental issues for over 15 years now. They started the Green-Blue Environmental Outreach Programme back in 2005 with British Marine. And that ran very successfully for all that time, but it started to become obvious that people were asking what was the RYA itself doing about sustainability. So in 2018, the board committed to look at wider sustainability issues, and they recruited me to the role I'm in now. So there was somebody doing a similar role before, but the focus wasn't so much on the RYA's own activities really. And that commitment continued through 2019. We recruited more people into the team, a sustainability officer, also an administrator as well. And we developed our new environmental policy, recommitted to the Green-Blue programme, and started our kind of series of workshops with staff to start off with. And then in 2020, we completed that workshops programme. We drafted the strategy and action plan, had that approved. We took a little kind of tactical decision to switch our energy supplies over to electricity, and we started working up a programme for sustainability champions within the departments within the organisation. And this year, our main objectives this year are to get an ISO 14001 system designed and in place, and to develop our plans for pathways to zero for carbon, waste and pollution. And we're also looking at an accreditation programme for our kind of outreach side of things for members, affiliates and marine businesses through the British Marine Connection as well, and hopefully working with BASIS on some of those aspects of it. So going back to 2019, when I started, there was a kind of very brief mention of environment in our environmental policy in our employment handbook. It was just a few sentences. So we started by making a few kind of clear declarations of intent, basically. We joined the UN Global Compact, we signed up to Sports for Climate Action later in the year as well, and then we rewrote our environmental policy. So these are the kind of outward-looking statements that basically ensured that other people were then expecting us to do things, which I think is quite important in this process, really. So it raises that expectation, really. And the environmental policy, apart from being a kind of commitment from the management of the organisation to fund and resource what we're doing, it's also what I saw as the starting point for the strategy, really. So the strategy is aimed to deliver that one-page statement of what we're going to do. So it's basically saying we're going to mitigate harm, we're going to minimise harm, mitigate harm, and manage and improve our environmental performance in kind of very simple terms. But in order to do that, we then need to start looking at the scope of what the organisation did. And just to give you a sense of the kind of challenges that raises for an organisation like the RYA, this is the kind of potential scope of what we're looking at here. So we have over 150 staff. This is all pre-COVID, so some of these numbers may change, not the staff number, but some of the other numbers may change. So we have 112,000 members, individual members. Around 250,000 people are trained each year around the world through RYA programs. Turnover is about 21 million a year. We have 2,400 recognised training centres in 58 countries. There are some challenges around COVID, around whether that will continue at that level. There's also some challenges around Brexit about that, because we're certainly already seeing Spain deciding they're not going to recognise some of the RYA's activities in country there. So we probably will see some changes to these numbers over the coming years. And over the last, I don't think that's probably 15 to 20 years, we've introduced nearly 1 million children to sailing. We also run the British sailing team, so that's the Olympic team and all of the pathways that run up to that elite sport performance. We operate, we run the RYA Dinghy Show, not last year, not this year, but it'll start up again properly next year. We have a sailability programme for disability, and we have separate companies in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with the Green Blue programme that I've already mentioned. So the scope is potentially massive. So we needed to think about how we were going to approach that as we developed the strategy. So we split it essentially into three core areas, and this proposal came from our CEO. She was very engaged in this early stage of the process, really. And it's based on the work that the International Olympic Committee did on their own sustainability. So we thought we would split into these three areas. Areas we control, so that's our kind of staff and our facilities, that we can put policies in place for, and we can make sure that things happen in that area. Things that we manage, so that's the events that we run, things like pensions and investments and so on, where we can't fully control what goes on there, but we can actively manage what happens in those areas. And then the area of influence, which is that hundreds of thousands of people engaging with the organisation every year, the clubs, the training centres, members and our partners. And one of the key things that we realised when we were doing this is that if we make a little tiny bit of difference in this area of influence, so that 500,000 people or so that are members of clubs, for example, then that will have a far bigger impact than everything we might do with our facilities and our operations and our staff. So in a sense, the core control area, we need to manage that for our own benefit, but also it's that kind of the visible part of what we do, but the kind of invisible bit of it to external organisations is probably equally important, if not more important, that influence and outreach that we do. So once we got this kind of basic concept in place, we then started a series of consultations with staff and the various committees we have. We started this in, I think, September 2019 and ran through to middle of 2020. So we had 200 people at 25 workshops. So these were all the different meetings we had. And the green dots there are our various departments and the membership there, racing, the sailability programme, our regional development office and so on. We had sessions with the home countries, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, various committees that were involved. So the Planning and Sustainability Committee, which is the committee I report into, our regional support network, who look at planning and support for clubs around the country, External Affairs Committee and the board. And we also engaged with our clubs through the various regional club conferences, so South West Midlands, South. So these are all the club conferences that myself and the other members of my team attended over the autumn of 2019 and the very early part of 2020. And then in the latter part of the process, we also consulted with Dan Redding at World Sailing as our kind of international governing body for our sport. And he actually used to work in the team that I now head up at the RYA. So just to give you an idea of what we did at the workshops, so how we kind of engaged with people. We started with a video. I'm not going to show it now, but it's a brief video from Conservation International, which is Julia Roberts as Mother Nature, and it kind of sets that global context of why we need to take action and why it's so important that we all take responsibility for what we're doing. We then ran through the kind of latest science, which there's obviously newer examples of this available now, but this is what we did at the time. We looked at the Committee on Climate Change risk summaries across various aspects of the environment. We focused in on things that were of direct importance, I suppose, to the sailing community. So we looked at coastal erosion. This map here is quite frightening, really. So the red areas around the south and mostly around the south and east coasts here, by 2025, with no active intervention, it's estimated there will be a retreat of 25 metres in all of those areas, which is quite significant if you've got sailing club on the coast, or a slipway on the coast, or whatever. So it brings it home to the activity that all of our members are involved with, really. And we also looked at sea level rise, again, of critical interest to sailing, and focused on the fact that the majority of this is likely to happen in the south of the country rather than in the north. So again, if you start seeing a metre sea level rise where I'm based here in Hamble, that will take out most of the foreshore. So significant for our sector again. At the time when we were doing this, there was also a lot going on out in the media as well. So we focused in on what was happening with Extinction Rebellion and the protests in London, and the kind of wide support for those protests and that activity, and also the activities of Greta Thunberg and that kind of intergenerational focus that comes through strongly from young people getting engaged in this process and engaged in the issues. We discussed national reports and policy, so the UK government net zero emissions by 2050 target. That's obviously all been updated now with the sixth carbon budget from the Committee on Climate Change and the Energy White Paper. So if I was doing this again now with people, I would update the latest data. But also we have drivers within our own sector as well. So World Sailing have their own Agenda 2030, which is based around the Sustainable Development Goals, mainly looking at how they run events rather than the organisation itself. But we pulled some useful ideas out of there. And the IOC Sustainability Strategy, which is, I say, where we got that kind of control, manage, influence focus from. We looked at what the RYA was already doing. So the environmental policy went through the statements in there and discussed those with the staff. And also went through the kind of tactical things we've done, so the declarations for the UN Global Compact, and discussing the kind of wider sustainability issues, so not just the environment, but looking at poverty and health and well-being and inequalities and so on. So those aspects as well that we wanted to draw into our strategy. We discussed what was happening with Green Blue at the time, so we did a relaunch of that really in 2019 with a new contract with British Marine, which expanded the funding for it. We produced a new website, and we increased the staffing in that area of the business as well. And as I think I probably already mentioned, we switched our energy supplies over to Ecotricity over 2019, 2020. Most of it happened in 2020 actually. So going for a kind of deep green energy supplier and starting a partnership with them, which will help us encourage all of our members to switch over to a green energy supplier as well as doing it ourselves. So once I've done that introduction, we then asked this kind of four questions of each group. So what impacts do they have in their day-to-day activities? Which are the most significant? How can they mitigate them? And what information and resources would they need in order to take the action that they think should be taken? And this was to get a debate going with each department and each committee. And it also helped us to learn a lot more about what the organisation did. So it's that kind of learning process, really. And so there's a couple of examples here. So the sailability team, they were focusing on travel in particular, discussing electric vehicles. They wanted Teslas, of course, that's what they were after. But we talked about things like having a lift share app and recognising that a lot of the activities, a lot of the events we put on, probably the biggest impact is people travelling to those events rather than the events themselves. We were looking at safety boats, looking at having guidance on which type of boat to use for which situation. If you're out there with a learning group of young children, you probably could cope at the moment with a small electric engine. If you've got a foiling catamaran, you need to be able to go at 50 knots occasionally, so then you still need to have a conventional outboard at the moment, but just thinking about the guidance we could put out for that, and conferences, workshops, and working with their partners. So there's a whole host of these for each department. The racing one, far bigger impact really. We're talking about the Olympic sailing team here, so they do a lot of flights, they do a lot of shipping. They have 45 ribs. I've got no idea we had so many rigid inflatable boats that are in a boat store nearby. I've still not managed to visit it, but I'm sure I will do at some point. And then with the racing side, we get the issue of sponsorship, and at the moment we have lots of very large SUVs So looking at how we can start switching those kind of things across. But it really was very useful to us to think through and to learn from what other people were doing. And the approach we took, I guess, was based on my previous experience. For the last 20 years before the RYA, the organisations I worked in were cooperatives. And so we used to engage with people all the time. And by engaging in this way, it enables us, as I say, to learn and to listen to people, but also to manage expectations about what we can achieve. So it helps to kind of have those conversations with as many people as possible. Otherwise, it's quite easy to get wrong-footed by people's expectations, really. There's a great saying in the co-op movement, which is have your say, but not necessarily your way. And I think that was the kind of expectation management we were trying to do. So once we'd had all of those meetings, we kind of pulled together a summary. I won't go through this in detail, but as you would expect, the kind of key areas we ended up talking about were energy, waste, procurement, and travel. But in the process, we learned lots of detail, engaged with everybody, and started to embed these ideas within the department. And even just having the conversations with people started them thinking about how they could improve their own performance, just things like logistics. And they'd sit there in a meeting, look at each other and say, why do we do things like that? We could save money, and we could save time, and we could save energy by doing things in a different way. They're just so focused in on the day-to-day normally that they don't kind of think wider. So encouraging that thinking and that discussion was, I think, a key benefit of the approach we took, really. So once we completed all of that, I produced a draft of the document. Dan at World Sailing reviewed that, and then Sarah, our CEO, approved it and took it to the board, and we had that approved in June 2020. So the full document is quite long. We've got an executive summary as well, but to give you an idea of the kind of core features of it, there's really four main areas. One is embedding, which was the start of which was that work with the departments and with the committees and with the clubs to get their input. And that's continuing with looking in particular at having sustainability champions in each team so that we get that communication, maintain that communication with the departments. We were very keen on consistency, so making sure we tied it into the wider RYA strategy, which is one of the reasons we were keen to do this before the RYA strategic review. That was actually due to be completed by now for the next 4 years, but because of COVID, we're just on a 1-year recovery plan. But within that, it references the sustainability strategy. So there are two key kind of ongoing issues that are addressed, that continue to be addressed through that recovery plan, one of which is diversity and the other of which is sustainability. So really pleased that that's really in there now with the board. The board are very supportive of all of this. We're very keen to take a tactical approach. So whilst we're busy measuring all of our scope emissions and so on, we're taking actions straight away whenever we see an opportunity, because we know that things need to be done, like switching the energy supply. You don't need to analyse all your energy use to realise it's a good thing to switch to a renewable energy supplier. And then the fourth element is the kind of checks and balances and improvement process. And that for us heavily involves our Planning and Sustainability Committee, which is a kind of group of experts that meet about once a quarter and advise our team on what we're doing. And so they've proved invaluable, really, to reviewing what we're suggesting and challenging what we're doing. So also out of the, this shouldn't have come in order like that, I'll just put them all up at once. There's an action plan that we put together out of the strategy as well, 45 initial actions in 6 areas. So the communication side of it, as I've said already, is quite critical. So inspiring, informing and enabling. So that's helping people to make decisions, giving them great stories to tell and helping them along their way. Whole load of elements around transparency, so reporting on our performance. That includes in areas where, because we're a relatively small organisation, legally we don't have to report on things like gender pay gaps and that kind of thing, but we're going to do that anyway to keep that kind of transparent approach to things. We report through the UN Global Compact. We put reports into our annual report and accounts now, and next year I think we're going to also go for the fair tax mark. So it's just trying to kind of get those there's kind of that clarity that we're doing things properly. I'm busy at the moment on the zero carbon pathway, and the zero pollution and zero waste pathways will follow. So this is not just looking at the RYA's performance, this is looking across the whole of recreational boating. Making sure that we pick up biodiversity. It's not a kind of major part of what we do, but because of where we kind of practice our sport, if you like, we're very engaged with the natural environment. So we're doing that through the clubs and through the work we do on planning and planning gain and so on. So we respond to marine license applications and so on, and we introduce concepts around biodiversity within that, and then influencing through procurement and our partnerships. I do have a whole load of examples of the action plan. I won't go through them in detail, but obviously the Inspire, Inform, Enable bit focuses on the Green Blue, our outreach program, and embedding information in our training programs as well. Transparency in people, I think I've already mentioned those. Zero waste and pollution, things like single-use plastics at events and so on, but also looking across the whole boating sector, right the way through to end-of-life boats, which is a major issue at the moment that we address mainly through the European Boating Association, which Chris mentioned earlier on. So through my role as Environment Secretary there, we're involved with the European Commission's work on that. And then zero carbon side of things. So one of the difficult areas we need to look at is carbon offset, particularly with the Olympic team, of course. So how do we manage that? How do we make sure that that's done in a sensible way, in a correct way? Biodiversity I mentioned, and procurement and partnerships. So at the moment we don't really have a clear procurement policy within the organisation. So that's one of the first things I'm working on, because that's a big impact for us. But also when we're doing events, it's working with venues, of course, and then also looking at our investments and the more tricky area of sponsorship, which will be something that we'll be looking at as sponsorships come up for renewal, whether they tie in with our objectives for sustainability. So what next? Well, implementing that action plan, that's given me a great long list of 45 things I've got to do over the next 2 to 3 years. Focus on procurement. The sustainability champions, we're doing some training with them. We're training them up to be auditors for our ISO 14001 system, and we're also training them internally on issues around sustainability. Interestingly, the vast majority of people who volunteered for those roles are significantly younger than me, and have not a huge amount of work experience, and so we're training them up in the issues and so on. But it's really good to see young people getting really engaged with this. Reaching out to our affiliates is a key thing we're doing at the moment. I had a meeting with my own sailing club last night to talk about sustainability, to support them, and looking at accreditation pathways for them, hopefully utilising some of the work that BASIS has been doing on accreditation, and then further training across the organisation and our certification. So that's what we're doing over the next 6 to 12 months, I guess. Those are the key things that we're focusing on there. So that's it. That's my presentation, and I'm hoping that it triggers some questions. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thanks, Phil. I certainly found it really interesting, because having been involved in various ways with lots of strategies, I thought it was the clarity and the simplicity of it was what really appealed to me. It seemed to be, you had a really good idea, and obviously the consultation part of it. So I'm interested in the consultation part, because for me that's always the key in getting the best understanding, if you like, of what it is that you're actually creating a strategy for. Otherwise, it's always just done in a vacuum, top down, not really mean anything to the people who actually have to live by it and kind of deliver it. So, how did you? The consultation, was it kind of a random thing? You just decided we're gonna do everybody, or did you segment it a bit?
So. I mean, as I say, my approach was to try and involve as many people as possible. So what I did was I took the proposal along to our senior management team meeting to get the buy-in from the heads of department. And there's a varied response, of course. Some people really want to engage, and some people don't at that point. But as soon as you start doing it, then with the support of the CEO, who really wanted to make sure everybody was engaged, then people start feeling they're left out, and they start demanding to be involved in the process if they're not included. So it kind of works both ways, really. If you start giving people the opportunity, then everybody wants the opportunity. So we did get a really good level of engagement. It is interesting because, as in all organisations, there are managers manage things in different ways, and so in some areas you could tell that people weren't used to being asked their opinion of things in some areas, and so that was really nice to see them start coming out themselves and start making proposals. The other thing I found really positive was that people were willing to go a lot further than I thought in terms of thinking about what they did. So clearly the kind of level of media coverage that sustainability has nowadays has really got through to people. And so you kind of start tentatively talking about something like sponsorship, and people would say, yeah, we really do need to look at this. And people who lead on those areas and are concerned with that. And, what we're not saying we can do something about it immediately, but we can look ahead and say, by 2025, we'll make sure that everything is aligned with our principles. We don't have to do everything now. I think that's the key thing. And that's one of the advantages of the kind of pathways approach, really, because we can look ahead and say, by 2030, we want to be in this position. What do we need to do over the next 10 years to get there? Otherwise, it can seem really overwhelming. It can be really difficult to see how you're going to get there.
So that often is the problem. Sometimes it's just too broad a piece of work and too long term. Okay, we've got some questions coming in. Anna, do you want to ask them?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay, so Richard Parker is asking, are any of your training centres taking action already, and are there already informal sustainability champions in your community?
So yes, there are. So there's certainly the training centres that are based out of clubs rather than the ones that are training centres, solely training centres. They are taking quite a lot of interest in this, and it's usually if there's somebody on the committee there who has a particular interest in it, or even works in the sustainability field, then they're taking things forward far more quickly. There's definitely a push from the training centres to make sure we include environmental issues in the training programs. So that's really good that that's coming from the grassroots as well as from us. So we've got a programme over the next 5 years. It takes about 5 years to go through our whole curriculum to review all of those programmes and help push that information out. But yes, they certainly are taking interest in it, and we're trying to get a little group together of clubs who've already done things in this area, because they all feel like they're working on their own. So some have done environmental building programs when they've replaced or refurbished a clubhouse. Some have installed renewable energy systems. Some have done a lot of work on waste management and so on. So I'm trying to bring them together into a little kind of core group, if you like, of people who've already taken some serious action, so that we can get some case studies together, because I think that's probably the best way to help other clubs and training centres take their own pathways through this.
Great. Jonathan Platt is saying, who else within the sporting context NGB have you discussed this issue with, and are you aware of others making similar progress?
Well, I think we've seen other presentations at the BASIS webinars from organisations that are doing significant amounts of work on this, haven't we? So we haven't really engaged with other NGBs other than in the water sports sector, I suppose. Anything where you might get wet, we've talked quite a lot to the canoeists and the rowers and people like that. We're also engaged with people like the Inland Waterways Association. So you wouldn't think of them necessarily as sports, but they're boat related and they're water related. And they produced some really good information recently on the future of propulsion in particular, which is a key thing for our area of work. So yeah, we do engage with as many as we can. But I think Chris, we've had the Lawn Tennis Association have presented, haven't they, and various others to the BASIS group, and there are quite a lot of people who I mean, it's good to have a bit of competition in it. You know, I think we're doing quite well, and then I see somebody else, and I think, oh no, we're falling behind now. We've got to catch up. So I guess that's the nature of being involved in sport, isn't it? You want to, if you can make it competitive, it's even better. We thought about doing that internally, actually, within the organisations. I think setting some targets, because certainly the racing team always want to win. So
Yeah.
we could do that. I see Hattie's there with her hand up, so she's presented before, hasn't she?
Yeah, and it took me ages to work out how to raise my hand. I was fiddling. And look, and it's gone down now.
I just lowered it because you're talking.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so I don't leave I don't want to jump the queue. I had a question, but
we'll follow your question with the others. So do go first, Hattie. Go on.
Are you sure? Sorry,
Yeah.
if there are Phil, thank you. Really good sort of holistic strategy, really nice to see and beautifully presented. I'm really interested in where you're up to on offsetting, just what you would consider to be in scope. And you're saying you're developing a policy. You know, I'm sort of grappling with that for the All England, and just wondering where you guys have got to.
So we haven't got anything approved yet at all, so it's a bit difficult to talk about it too much. But we'll definitely be looking at the kind of what are called the gold standard offsetting programs, because you really have to look at ones that make a real difference that wouldn't happen otherwise, and that's the really difficult aspect to grapple with, really. I mean, if you look at some of the more concerning reports on climate change, then we really need to go beyond net zero, which means offsetting doesn't really work at all. In the sense, you've got to get to zero and go beyond it to bring the climate back to where it needs to be. In which case, I suppose offsetting would have to look at things like carbon capture and storage, even, and go that far, rather than. I think the focus is often on planting a few trees, and I'm not convinced that that's good enough, because we need to plant the trees anyway and regrow the forests. As part of the natural cycle of things. So I think we're concerned about looking at kind of significant investments that are happening, which are delivering on renewables projects that wouldn't happen otherwise, for example, that kind of thing.
And what's what would you be looking to balance with offsets versus reductions that you're going to make?
So it would have to be that kind of is some of the travel effectively. Some of the travel things is probably the key part of it. I think all of the most of the rest of it we can probably deliver through reductions and through changes of approach. I guess some of the materials side of it as well. So boats that are made effectively from fossil fuel based materials, and at the end of their life, at the moment they generally get burned, which is effectively burning a fossil fuel. So I think it's mostly going to be around that international travel element of it that will be the most difficult. I think something like the fleet vehicles we use, we're due to replace some of those at the moment. Electric vehicles aren't there yet for us, but what we're thinking
Although we've got the charge in 5 minutes battery just announced today, which is really exciting.
But we can't buy one in March, which is when we need to replace our vehicle fleet. So I think what you're saying there is absolutely key. It's about reducing it first. So when I'm talking to Ian Walker, who's the head of racing, we're talking about what do we actually need. So traditionally, we've had dozens of vehicles delivered every 6 months to the RYA HQ. They're all very large vehicles that can go and do all of the jobs we require. But how many of them actually need to be able to tow a boat up and down the country and around Europe? Probably a quarter of them. How many of them just go backwards and forwards between Hamble and Portland to the main sailing centre down there? Those could actually be electric already, particularly if we put charging points in at Portland. So it's trying to that offsetting. We have to make sure we don't do it in place of the reduction programme, and that's what concerns me about offsetting, is that you can kind of forget about all the rest of it if you spend enough time on offsetting, enough money on offsetting. The other thing we need to think about, which again, I haven't had these conversations internally yet, is how much do you allow per tonne of carbon? If you talk to, if you go and buy an air ticket, you can pay a couple of pounds extra, and they notionally offset your emissions. If you go to the UN Global Compact and look at their calculations, you'd probably be spending £100 extra rather than £2.50. So it's thinking about how you do that and which agency would we go to get those answers, really, to do it in a proper way. You have to be ready, I think, for those difficult emails you get as soon as you make any of these announcements, don't you? You have to be able to justify everything you do. I mean, even the switch to ecotricity, I had several emails telling me I was virtue signalling. I've never been accused of virtue signalling before because we announced it, because we said we'd done it. So I think we need to be confident in our responses, and I don't think I'm there yet on offsetting. Where have you got to with it, just as a matter of interest to you?
So, I mean, I think for us, offsetting will be part of our approach to, we've got a net zero operational emissions goal for 2030, and included in those operational emissions are flights of players and tournament officials to the UK to participate in the championships. And by 2030, we're still going to be in aeroplanes powered with mostly jet fuel. So for me, we will need to look at offsetting for that. I think done well, it's beneficial in a number of ways, and it's if you're getting involved perhaps in woodland creation, that's around, you have your biodiversity benefits, community benefits, flood alleviation, as well as carbon sequestration. So I think finding the right way of doing it, and definitely doing it as a last resort once everything else has been achieved. But so it will be part of what we do, just working out quite how and when and making sure that we do it right. But also, do we widen the scope beyond currently? We're just reporting on what I'm currently able to measure, but there's a much bigger impact that we know we influence. So we're sort of going to make things more difficult for ourselves. But that's not to say that it's not the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And the difficulty, I think, is as we learn more about what our organisations do, it's very difficult to produce a little graph that shows things going down gradually, because you'll find something and it suddenly jumps up again, doesn't it? You've got to kind of recalculate everything that went before to give you that kind of trend line. It's quite hard to get that right.
Yeah, people want to see a nice smooth, and it's sort of is bump along, drop when there's something significant, up again. We might, for example, increase as we degas, we are likely to increase our electricity consumption. And anyway, that's going a bit off consultation topic.
Thanks, Hattie. That was actually a pretty good discussion. There's a great question here from Meredith Whiting about smaller voluntary organisations. Are there any foundational steps that you would consider to be key and manageable with less experienced group of volunteers? And he said that in the context of developing a strategy policy for the first time for those kinds of organisations. Now, I can identify with that, having worked in the recreational game in cricket.
Sure. So the Green Blue programme, we put some information out there and advice out there for all of our affiliates, and within that there is a kind of guide to producing a basic environmental policy and a checklist you can run through. So obviously the basis one is very sophisticated and covers a huge scope, but we've tried to reduce it down to some kind of key areas around energy and waste and so on. We do one that's specifically for coastal clubs and one that's for inland clubs, because some of the requirements are different around anti-fouling and invasive species and things like that. And we also then have a guide as to how to turn that into an action plan. So we've tried to make it as simple as possible. But the first thing we always say is that you need to have somebody on your committee who is responsible for this, who's driving it forwards and is reporting back to the committee on a regular basis. And then we've been asking the clubs what else they need in terms of advice on that. And one of the things we're now starting to develop is a database of suppliers and information that they can access. They can't access it yet, but that's the objective, is to give them simple guidance on where to go to buy clothing that doesn't have such a big impact, that kind of thing, that they buy all the time, how to look at their requirements for their safety boats, and when they come to upgrade them, whether it's time for them to go electric or whatever. So we're trying to help them through it. There's some really simple things they can do to start with. It's the real basics around energy efficiency to start with a clubhouse, for example, checking it's all draft proofed and insulating it a bit better and switching to a green energy supplier. All those kind of things you can do very easily without any significant knowledge. Most of our clubs have people in who have quite a lot of good technical knowledge and practical skills because they're used to trying to keep everything going on a shoestring. So if you give them the concepts, then usually somebody there will know how to do things. But as I say, what we found is we provide all this information. It gets downloaded a lot, and when we go back to clubs, we find that they've got stuck. So we're trying to run webinars now as well. So we do webinars where we try to encourage people to download the checklist and go through it with us online live, so that we can get them moving. But I do think the key thing is having somebody who's identified on the committee to start with.
Yeah,
The first step, really.
You need a champion, don't you? So that's,
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I've also got a question. This is on a slightly different note about social media. So what role does social media and comms play with regards to sharing an insight for your commitment to sustainability? That's from Making Sang.
Yeah. So the RYA has a number of social media channels. I don't really engage with it very much myself, I have to say. I'm sorry to say. But we have a media person within our wider team. So my team is five people, including the planning and sustainability side of things. But we're part of a wider team of, it's called Government Affairs Department. So we do all of the kind of lobbying and engagement with government and so on. And that team has its own media person, and she pushes me all the time to give her little sound bites and things, and she pushes those out through the RYA media channels. And Kate Fortnum, who runs the Green Blue, does a great job of pushing it all out through the Green Blue media channels as well. So it does form a significant part of it. We do have a reasonable number of followers on those, but I'm not sure what impact it has overall, because it's mostly younger people who engage with it, and most of the people on our committees are quite a bit older than I am, so they probably don't see that.
Well, I was actually surprised when I was actually surprised when you talked about virtue signalling. I mean, you know, when you change electricity suppliers. So, is there a team to manage that and potential trolling and that kind of thing?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So the RYA does a lot of media. Actually, there's a media person embedded in every department. So we do cover that quite thoroughly. And if it gets too difficult for us to respond to, then people who are professionals in media coverage will do that. They'll take our input and they'll deal with it direct. So yeah.
It's interesting what you say, though. I mean, a lot of the pressure for change will come from your younger members, and hopefully they're talking to the committee. I mean, cricket is not far off that. You have obviously a kind of embedded, and for a lot of good reasons. You know, they're the people who volunteered and put in the hard yards, basically running these community clubs. Yeah, you're right. They, in a lot of ways, they are resistant to change because that's the way they go. But the pressure is coming from the younger members to say, look, we have to change and we can't just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So,
and if the clubs want to keep them engaged and keep them as members, then they need to take action. I mean, we did put a question in last year for the first time in our kind of main questionnaire that goes out to clubs and about the environment and how important they felt it was, and it came out very high up the agenda for everybody, actually. So it was right up there with health and safety and child protection issues, basically, which surprised us. But as I say, I think the coverage in the media and people's concerns, if you look at all of the polling around the country, people are concerned about climate change and they want to know how they can do their bit. And I think there's an expectation that clubs will do something now. I mean, as you say, coming from younger people in particular. And I think for a young person, in terms of looking at it as a career path as well and getting engaged with it, the great thing about sustainability is you learn a little bit about everything. It's not too, it might seem like a specialism, but you have to learn about the whole scope of what your organisation does. So it's a great opportunity to help develop leadership skills as well. I think it's brilliant for young people, I think.
Yeah. I'm fully supportive of that. If anyone else has any questions, please just raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask the questions directly. Otherwise, I'm going to ask, I know Russ Seymour had a couple of questions that he might like to pose. Russ, are you ready to do that?
Chris, you've dropped that on me unawares. And I'll apologise to Phil and say I was actually writing a few emails and I've not been listening for the last few minutes. I'm really sorry to everybody. Let me have a think and we'll come back.
Yeah, I thought you had some difficult questions lined up.
I mean, I just a comment. I mean, I think that it's such a good process, and it's good to see, you know, a governing body, particularly one with so much sort of recreational impact. You know, everybody knows that I always talk about professional sports because that's my background, but the opportunity for recreational sport to actually influence the participants is huge, and it just multiplies that beyond your direct impact. So for me, it has been fascinating. I promise I did listen to the presentation. I've stuck on a couple of emails, but no, Phil, I think it's fantastic. And I've actually downloaded your the 2030 sustainability policy, and I'm going to have a good read of that later.
Great. I mean, one of the interesting things I find with the conversation saying about the kind of recreational side of it is when I had that conversation with my sailing club last night, of course, where people need guidance is in deciding what the significant impacts are. And so we started talking about racing, and so they put racing marks out in Southampton Water for their Wednesday evening races, and they were saying, oh, we could massively reduce our impact if we didn't keep moving the windward mark all the time, because we race out there with a powerboat and we move it around. And I said, but you know, it would have some impact, but actually the biggest impact is all those people travelling to Hamble to come racing on a Wednesday. So if you can encourage people to share cars, it's hidden and it's not very visible and it's not very exciting, if you like, from a media point of view. But actually, if what you really want to do is reduce your impact, then getting all those people coming down from London to pick up the people in Basingstoke on the way is the way to do it. So some of it can be quite boring in some ways, but so it depends what you're trying to achieve, doesn't it? You kind of need to do both. You need to be seen to be doing the right thing, but you also need to do the right thing underneath as well. So I found that quite fascinating. Really.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's you just need to initiate that conversation to actually get people to see beyond what might be obvious, to see something which is equally obvious in some way, and progress it in that way.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, they got quite excited about the new high-tech solution to racing marks, which is you can buy a battery-powered buoy that with a GPS receiver in it, and you tell it where you want it to go, and it sits there in the middle of the sea for you to sail around. And if you want to move it 20 meters one way, you just tell it, and it moves for you. So there's some interesting. That gets a different group of people interested. The techie side of it and the techie solutions, but yeah, it's not a bad idea actually.
Yeah.
We have another question from Richard Parker. Do we feel it essential that these initiatives are inevitably top down and supported by standards or certification? And does technology, especially social media, enable you to facilitate grassroots coordination, or does this mean losing control? So a bit twofold.
Okay, so kind of starting at the end, we don't really have control over our clubs. They affiliate to us. They don't have to do a huge amount in order to affiliate. We're gradually increasing the amount they have to do. So we have to influence them rather than controlling them. But I think in terms of the top-down, bottom-up question, the initial decision was top-down, but all of the ideas are coming from the bottom-up now, and they're pushing their way back up to the board and putting pressure on the board to make changes, which is really good. But I think that the standard side of it, for clubs and for individuals, it's more about recognition. It's about being able to put their hand up and say, look, we're doing something. For the RYA and for other national governing bodies, I think it's important that we have standards and certification at that level, because it's very easy for us all to say, oh, we understand all these issues and we know we're doing the right thing. But if you don't have that external audit, nobody's really going to believe you. When I used to work at the Centre for Alternative Technology, we were putting a new building up there, and there was a woodyard over the road, which produced local timbers that were sustainably grown, but they didn't have FSC certification. And everyone was saying, well, we know that it comes from over the road there. We know Bob who runs it. It's absolutely fine, isn't it? And my response to that was, yeah, but if anybody else said that to us, we wouldn't believe them, would we? We would say that you had to get a certification. So I do think it's important to have that formal recognition. I mean, you can be cynical about things like ISO 14001. I mean, if you're a chemical plant and you know how much you're polluting and you commit to reducing your pollution, then you can get ISO 14001. But it does make you put those processes in place, and it makes sure that things don't get lost through the cracks and so on. So I think they're important at our level. I think for a club, there's no need to go to that extent. I think having something like the basis approach to it, where you kind of go through a spreadsheet questionnaire and you answer a few questions and you commit to making some changes, I think that's absolutely fine, and it gives you some consistency at least across the organisation, so that you can see that everybody's doing things in a sensible way. For our accreditation approach, we want to have it at all levels really. So we're thinking of having a simple boater pledge where you sign up online and you say, I'm going to anti-foul my boat properly, I'm going to manage the pollution from it, I'm going to manage the waste, and then you get a little burgee to put on the rigging to fly around, to fly with the green-blue logo on it. And we're going to take that all the way through through British Marine and the Yacht Harbour Association, a full sustainable accreditation for mariners, which will have the same branding all the way through. But the idea is to recognise what people are doing at all stages of that. So you make an initial pledge and you get something to show for it. And what we're hoping is that means that if you're a boater who's flying that flag, you look for somewhere to moor your boat that has the same certifications and the same I suppose, same values that you have. Really, that's what we're trying to get to. So I think it's not one size fits all with this. I think the RYA needs the full standard. The club doesn't. Does that answer the question, Richard? I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
I thought you did well. Richard just said, thanks, Phil, for a really interesting presentation, some great ideas and useful answers. I think it does fit with what the answers he was looking for. Thank you. Any more questions? Nope. Anyone want to raise their hand? We've got about a minute or so, or we'll wrap up a bit early. Okay, I'll take from the silence. We'll wrap it up a bit early. Oh, sorry, one quick one. Right, Sally just saying thank you very much. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I thought
really
that was really interesting, because it was a great insight in the way that you manage, produce, and then deliver a strategy. And like I said, the clarity and the simplicity is the most appealing thing. And yeah, obviously, I look forward to discussing more with you at our next management meeting. And to everyone out there, thank you for coming along to the presentation. I hope you found it useful. And as I was saying to Meredith, we're here to help exactly with that kind of thing, from professional clubs right down to grassroots or single member clubs. That's really what we're here for. So we'll wrap it up there, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next webinar. Anna, could you just give details on that?
17th of February. Details on the website soon.
Okay, and please make sure to go and visit the website, basis.org.uk. There's lots of information on there. And if you'd like to sign up, please do onto the newsletter. And if you want to look at membership, please do that as well. Right, thank you, everybody. See you in a few weeks' time.